Hello everyone, let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about histology. Now histology is simply the science that studies tissues in the body and how they function. You recall when we discussed the organization of the human body, we said that different types of cells can come together and function as a unit. And we call that unit a tissue. Now, in addition to the cells, a tissue also contains a substance called extracellular matrix. Extracellular matrix is a combination of protein fibers, something called ground substance, and water. Extracellular matrix, or ECM as we sometimes refer to it, is often called the glue that holds cells together in a tissue. Now, when we talk about the body, there are 4 specific types of tissue that are found within it. 4 very broad categories of tissue. The first is called epithelial. The second is connective. The third is muscle. And the fourth is nervous. So throughout the body, there are these 4 types of tissue. There's a little device that people use to help remember the 4 tissue types in the body, and it's the word con-men. Con is for connective, and men is for muscle, epithelial, nervous. So just a little device to help us remember the names of the 4 kinds of tissue. Now you'll notice that tissue types 1 and 2 have been highlighted in red here because these are the 2 types of tissue we're going to talk about today. We will be talking about muscle tissue and nervous tissue in detail, just a little bit later in the course. So let's begin by talking about epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is found in several different locations throughout the human body. It's the type of tissue that covers our body surfaces, in other words, our skin. It's the tissue that lines the hollow cavities inside of our body, so the lungs and the stomach and the intestine, the bladder, the uterus, and so on. And finally, it's epithelial tissue that forms the glands that are found in our body. When it comes to the structure of epithelial tissue, there are some features that make it unique. Number 1, as a tissue, epithelial tissue has very tightly packed cells and relatively little ECM. Those cells are in contact with each other, in other words. They're situated right up next to each other, connected to each other, with a minimal amount of extracellular matrix around them. The cells in epithelial tissue also have polarity or directionality. Now I've got a star next to the word polarity here because it's important to note that when I use the word polarity with regards to a cell or to a tissue, it's not the same term that we were using when we talked about molecules. Remember, we said that a molecule is polar if it contains partial charges. Well, a cell or a tissue is polar if it has different structure on different sides. Another word we use to describe that is directionality. So in regards to epithelial tissue, we talk about an apical surface and a basal surface. to epithelial tissue. That's the polarity of this tissue. It has two different surfaces. They look different and they function differently. The apical surface of epithelial tissue is the surface that's exposed to the outside or to the space within a body cavity. The basal surface of that tissue is the more deeper surface, the part that's buried and hidden and fixed down into the body. The other thing to know about epithelial tissue is that on its basal surface, it's attached to a structure called a basement membrane. So epithelial tissue has an anchored basal surface. On this slide, I've got some more important structural characteristics of epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is avascular. Now, A here means without. So without vascularity, without blood vessels. Epithelial tissue does not have blood vessels in it. Now you might ask yourself, gosh, without blood vessels, how does it get its nutrients and how does it get rid of its waste and so on? Epithelial tissue has membrane that allows nutrients to move across relatively easily. We've talked about how permeability can be increased in some membranes, and epithelial tissue has that characteristic. Nutrients and wastes and so on are able to move across the apical and basal surfaces with ease. So no blood vessels, but extensive innervation. Epithelial tissue is highly innervated. Lots and lots of nerve endings are found in epithelial tissue. And what that means is that epithelial tissue is able to detect changes that are going on in the environment around it quite readily. Epithelial tissue is also highly regenerative. In other words, it replaces itself quite readily. Now, if you think about where epithelial tissue is found, this is important. It lines the surface of the body, and that surface is commonly exposed to things that will remove the surface layer of the tissue. Abrasive loss, in other words, occurs on the surface of the body. Every time you put your clothing on or take your clothing off, every time you bump into something, when you get in the shower, all of those things are going to abrade away the very surface level of your skin. Similarly, inside your body cavities, there is abrasive loss of tissue. If you think about your intestine, for example, as food and materials pass through your intestinal cavity, that food is passing by and scraping against the epithelium that lines it. That causes those cells to sometimes be lost, to be pulled away. So this abrasive loss of epithelial tissue has to be dealt with. Those cells have to be replaced, and they are replaced quite rapidly. In fact, epithelial tissue has one of the fastest rates of cell division in the body. Some of the epithelial linings in your body actually replace themselves once a day. Now, in order to be highly regenerative, a tissue has to have something else. It has to have a reserve of cells deep down within its layers that are able to do all of this rapid cell division. Those are what we call stem cells, and stem cells are abundant in epithelial tissue. On this slide, you can see the four primary functions of epithelial tissue in the body. They provide physical protection, selective permeability, secretions, and sensations. When it comes to physical protection, epithelial tissue is a barrier, a protective barrier. We said a minute ago that epithelial tissue gets abraded away as things rub up against it and pass by it. Those cells in the epithelial tissue are simply torn away. The good news for the epithelial tissue is that they will be rapidly replaced. But what the epithelial tissue is doing is protecting the deeper layers in the body from being abraded and from having cells lost, because some of those deeper tissues would not be able to recover from that kind of abrasion. So that epithelial tissue is providing protection. It is sort of sacrificing itself to the physical damage that happens to the body every day. Now, the other protection that epithelial tissue provides is protection against dehydration. You know, one of the places where this is most evident is in burn patients. A person who suffers a third-degree burn or worse over large amounts of their body, large areas of their body, is in terrible danger of death. And the number one danger that is produced by that kind of extensive burning is the danger of dehydration. The epithelial tissue prevents water loss. So when that tissue is gone because of burns, that patient rapidly dehydrates and is at risk of death. The other protection that epithelial tissue provides is protection against chemical exposure and protection against pathogens, biological organisms that might do us harm. A good example of how epithelial tissue protects us against chemical exposure is in our stomach. Your stomach is lined with epithelium, and your stomach is full of hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid can literally eat through living tissue. The reason that your stomach doesn't just digest itself is because it's lined with epithelial tissue that can secrete a thick layer of protective mucus. In that way, the hydrochloric acid is free to help digest the food in your stomach without digesting away the tissue of the stomach. Now, in addition to physical protection, epithelial tissue also provides selective permeability. We talked about selective permeability when we talked about membranes. All of the membranes in your body are selectively permeable. It becomes especially important in epithelial tissue because epithelial tissue is what lines the outside of your body and the inside of your body cavities. So it's the membrane of epithelial cells that are being exposed to the environment. This selective permeability of epithelial tissue, like all membranes, is going to help protect against certain things coming across the membrane and into the cells. Third on the list of functions for epithelial tissue is secretions. Epithelial tissues can secrete all kinds of different materials, and that secretion process, from glands that are located in epithelial tissue. Some of the secretions include things like oils or waxy substances that are important for the function of that particular epithelial tissue. Last on the list is sensation. We said earlier that epithelial tissue is highly innervated. There are lots and lots of sensitive nerve endings in epithelial tissue, and that allows it to detect changes that are going on in the environment around it and send that information to the brain. Things like touch and pressure and temperature, sight and smell and taste and hearing, all of those things can be picked up through those very sensitive nerve endings that are especially abundant in epithelial tissues. So now that we've talked about how epithelial tissue is structured and what its functions are, let's take a minute and start thinking about how we classify it. One of the things you're going to notice in anatomy and physiology is that everything we talk about falls into categories and groups. We classify things according to their characteristics. When it comes to epithelial tissue, we classify it according to the number of layers it has and the shape of the cells that are found in the tissue. Now, sometimes we also add on whether or not those epithelial cells have cilia on them. So, generally speaking, there are two broad subtypes of epithelial tissue. There's what we call simple epithelium, and there's what we call stratified epithelium. Simple just means single layer, and stratified means multi-layered. Now, under the category of simple epithelium, you'll notice that there are four different types: simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, and pseudo-stratified columnar. That's quite a mouthful. So all of these are simple epithelium. All of these have a single layer, but they have different shapes. Now, simple squamous epithelium is a single layer of flattened, wide, and irregularly shaped cells. Simple cuboidal, like the name suggests, is a simple layer of cells that have a cuboidal shape. They tend to have sort of rounded edges and a very centrally located nucleus. And I'll show you an image of this in a minute so you can see what I'm talking about. Simple columnar epithelium has cells that contain a columnar shape, a tall sort of rectangular shape. And instead of having the nucleus dead in the center of the cell, the nucleus tends to lie down at the basal surface of the cell. Finally, there's pseudo-stratified columnar. This is the strangest type of simple epithelium. It has the appearance at first of being stratified epithelium. It looks like it has layers. But when you look more closely, and again, we'll take a look at this in a moment, when you look more closely, there aren't distinct layers of cells in pseudostratified columnar epithelium. That's why it's called pseudostratified. The cells are sort of jumbled together, which gives it at first a look of being layered. But in reality, it's a single layer of jumbled up cells that have a columnar shape. Now, when it comes to the stratified epithelium, there are very similar shaped cells involved. There is stratified squamous. Those are, again, the flattened, sort of irregular looking cells. Stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar, and then a type that we refer to as transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium gets its name because the shape of the cells are actually changeable. They actually change and adapt to stretch. The most famous place that we find transitional epithelium is in the bladder. And if you think about it, the bladder is an organ that has to be able to withstand lots and lots of stretch as it fills up with urine. So the epithelium that lines the cavity of the bladder has to be able to respond to that stretch. And it does that by being of this transitional type. So on this slide, you can see an artist's representation of the different types of epithelial tissues. Remember, when we classify epithelium, the first thing we do is determine whether it's simple or stratified. Then we determine what kind of shape the cells have. Now, obviously, this is just a drawing, but it's a pretty good representation of what these tissues look like. Remember, first on our list is simple squamous epithelium. Simple meaning one layer, and squamous meaning that the cells are flattened out, and in living tissue, they have sort of irregular shapes. They're irregular borders around them. Next is simple cuboidal. These cells are characterized as having a very squared off shape, although the edges don't tend to be pointed, they tend to be rounded. And most notably, the nucleus in simple cuboidal epithelium. The nucleus in each one of these cells is centrally located. It literally lies right smack in the center of each cell. Simple columnar epithelium looks very different. The cells, and I'm outlining them here, each individual cell has the shape of a column. And instead of having the nucleus in the center, the nucleus tends to be located down on the basal surface of the cell. Remember, epithelium has polarity or directionality. There's an apical surface that faces either the outside environment or the cavity of the organ. And then there's a basal surface that lies on the deep side of the tissue. So these nuclei are all lined up down near the basal surface of this tissue. Down in the center of the slide, you can see some representations of stratified epithelium. Remember, that word stratified means layered. So stratified squamous epithelium is very similar to simple squamous. The only difference is that there are multiple layers of these squamous epithelial cells. Stratified cuboidal, again, just has multiple layers of cuboidal shaped cells. Same thing with stratified columnar. There are layers of the columnar shaped cells. Now, this is a representation of pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. Remember, this is technically a single layer of cells, but when you look at it at first, it looks layered. It looks like there are multiple layers of cells here. You have to get down and look at, under a microscope, the individual cell boundaries in order to realize that this is one layer of cells. It's just that the cells are shaped oddly and the nuclei don't line up. So unlike stratified columnar epithelium, true stratified columnar epithelium, where you get these very clearly ordered lines of nuclei in each layer, in pseudo-stratified columnar, the nuclei are sort of all over the place. So pseudo-stratified columnar is a simple type of epithelium. Finally, we have transitional epithelium. Remember, this is a multi-layered or stratified type. This drawing doesn't really do it justice, but the artist is trying to show us that there are multiple layers of cells, including a layer across the top that looks pretty ordered with the nuclei all in a line. The thing to remember about transitional epithelium is just that this is an epithelium that is multi-layered and very changing in its appearance. This is an epithelium that has to be able to change its cell shape in response to stretch.